I was 7 years old, my family called us together, and they gave us the news. We were gonna have a baby. And I was pretty excited about this because, well, no offense, but I had 2 younger sisters, and I was hoping a baby brother, balance the family out a little bit. This could be a really good deal for me, so I couldn't wait. And when it came time for my mom to go to the hospital, she said that my sisters had to go and stay with my aunts. And then she looked at me and she said, "Tom, I don't see why not. Why don't you just stay home with your dad?" 2 guys hanging out. We got a pile of dirty dishes going in the sink. It was a work of art. And then every night we made popcorn. And it was my job to put the butter on the popcorn, and every night I'd try to sneak a little extra butter on the popcorn, and one night I got it just right. My dad went upstairs to change, and while he was up there, I put 1 stick of butter on the popcorn. It was dripping through your fingers, just the way I liked it. My dad took one look at that popcorn and he said, "Tom, if we bring that into the living room and we get grease on your mother's couch, 2 guys are gonna become 2 pieces of dead meat." And then he said, "I think we should go to the beach." My father says strange things. You just stand back and watch. He went to the closet. He gets out the family beach towel, and then he puts it down in the hallway. He gets the TV going in the living room. He puts the popcorn in the middle of the towel, and now we sit out on the towel, kind of like we're at the beach, having popcorn, watching the TV. Now, this was back in the old days, back when the screen was really small and black, white, and boring. But it didn't matter, because I was hanging out with my dad. We're talking and carrying on. And then the phone rang. My dad got up, and he picked up the phone. He talked for a second. He seemed to get sad, and then he hung the phone up. And I said, "Dad, what happened?" And he said, nothing. It's going to be fine, Tom. Tom, I'm going to take you to your aunt's house for a couple of days." And then he packed me up, and off I went. And I ended up staying with my Aunt Ellen for about 2 weeks. And all the while she was on the phone, and I kept saying to her, "What's going on?" And she said, "Nothing, Tom." And then one day she said, "Tom, you're going to go home." And I said, "Aunt Ellen, is it a boy or a girl? What happened?" And she said, "It's a girl, Tom. But Tom, when you go home today, please just do your best to go easy." I didn't know what she was talking about. I got to the house, I went running up the stairs, and I ran into the living room. My dad was there. My sisters were back. My mom was there. And I started looking around the living room for the baby, but the baby wasn't anywhere. And my family sat us all down and said, "We have a little sister, and her name is Margaret," but that something had happened. And that Margaret had something called cerebral palsy. I didn't know what that meant. And I started asking questions, and they said it meant that she might not be coming home from the hospital. And if she ever did come home, she'd always have to be in a wheelchair. And I kept asking questions, and they said, well, maybe someday she could walk, but she'd be all grown up, and she'd always have to have braces, and she'd always have crutches. And then they said, "Tom, just stop, go upstairs, and try to be quiet for a while. I went upstairs to my room. I felt terrible. All I could think about was the baby at the hospital, all by itself. Well, we waited, and then we got the word. Margaret was going to come home. And on the day that my parents were going to go pick her up, they told me to go upstairs and put on the suit with a little bow tie and this tiny hat for my head. And then they said that I had to stand by the doorway, but I couldn't go out and play because I could wreck the suit. And they left for the hospital. My aunts and uncles show up. They've got all the food, but I can't eat because I could spill stuff all over myself. And I just stood out there on the porch and I waited. And then I looked down the street. And here comes our car. It was this old gray Plymouth. It was a kind of car back then. And I'm up on the porch and I'm looking down and I can see right into the front seat. And there's my dad and my mom, and in my mom's arms, there's a pink bundle. It's the baby. I'm going to get to see her, and I'm going to be the very first one. I start down the stairs when, behind me, I could hear all of my aunts thundering down the hallway. Well, I wanted to be polite, so I opened up the door, and my aunts went thundering right by me. They gather round my mother, and my mother brings the baby into the living room, and now everyone jams in there, and I'm left out in the hallway, all by myself. And I just don't fit. And then, as luck would have it, my great Aunt Tess got up to go into the kitchen and make tea. My great Aunt Tess is the scariest woman I have ever known. She was so terrifying that whenever she walked into a room, people just got out of the way. Well, she comes back towards the living room with her cup of tea, and I got in behind her. I grabbed her by the waist and started steering her around the living room, people leaping out of the way until we were over in front of the crib. I sent my Aunt Tess back to the couch because now I was in the front row. I looked in there. I could see the baby. I put my finger in there and the baby grabbed right onto it. And then she looked right at me with those little pink gums, and she gave me this great big grin. I was feeling fabulous until my Aunt Ellen leaned over and said, "Oh, look, the baby has gas." I said, "No, she doesn't. She likes me the best." My mother leaned over and said, "Tom, do you like your little sister?" And I said, "Yeah, Mom, I do. I really do. But Mom, I think you picked out the wrong one." My mother said, "Why would you think that?" And I said, "Because, Mom, look, there's nothing wrong with her." My mother said there was something wrong with her, just it was on the inside. I looked. I didn't see anything wrong with her at all, but I did start seeing something wrong with my mother. My mother was worrying all the time. Don't get drafts on the baby. Don't get dust on the baby. When we used to go out, she'd wrap the baby up like a birthday present. One day, she was getting the baby ready to go out and putting on the booties. She jumped back and said, "Her legs. Look at her legs. Oh, her legs, they're swelling up." And my mother ran for the telephone. I looked in the crib. Margaret's legs were puffy and stuff. My mother got on the phone and she called up our doctor, Dr. Frank. And this was back a long time ago, back when doctors used to really just come to the house. And we stood out in front, and the doctor comes roaring up, and I actually like Dr. Frank a lot. I mean, I know he gave me shots and all, but he was the coolest kid doctor because he was my size. I mean, he was tiny. You could look him straight in the eye. He goes running in, he looks in the crib, and he says, "I don't believe this." I'm watching, and he reaches in, and he unties the booties, and the legs start to go back down again. And then he turned to my mother and said, "Marion, you tied her booties too tightly." My mother started crying, said she just couldn't take this anymore. But the doctor said, "Marion, calm down. You're not going to hurt the baby." My mother never calmed down. But Margaret, she got to be 1, and she got to be 2, and she started crawling. It was then I had to admit something was wrong, because Margaret's arms, they moved fine, but her legs didn't move a lot. But, like I already told you, she did like me the best, and I know because whenever I was in a room, she'd crawl in there to be with me. She'd grab onto my pants or try to get my socks off, which is cute. But one day, I was 10, and she was 3, and I was in the dining room working on the big science project, and it was due. Margaret crawled in under the table and started pulling on my pants, trying to get my socks off, which is cute, I know, but I was busy. And for the very first time, I just lost it. I started screaming, "Margaret, I'm sick of you. Go bother other people. Get out of here. Leave me alone." And then I went back to work. It didn't take more than a minute or 2 before I felt awful. I looked around the room to find her, and she was sitting on the other side of the room with her back against the wall, just glaring at me. As she looked at me, and I looked at her, she kind of smiled a little bit and then started to push with her feet. I was watching, and she slowly pushed herself up the wall until she was standing. Now, remember, she's not going to walk. She's probably going to be in a wheelchair all of her life. I'm looking at her, and she's looking at me, and a foot comes out, and she takes a step, and then a second step, and a third step, and she's walking. "Ma! Margaret's walking, Ma! Margaret's walking, Ma!" I go running out into the kitchen. My mother was ironing. I said, "Ma, Margaret's walking in the dining room. Come on!" We go running in there and we look. And now, Margaret is just sitting on the floor. My mother said, "Tom, did you think I would laugh, Tom? Did you think this would be funny? Tom, I already told you she's not gonna walk. You don't make a joke about something like this. You keep talking like this, you're going to break my heart." And then my mom started to cry, and she ran out of the room. I looked at Margaret, and Margaret smiled at me. And that went on for 3 weeks. Every time we were alone, Margaret would push herself up the wall and walk. Every time I tried to run out of the room to tell somebody, she'd sit back down, look at me, and smile. I finally said, "Margaret, I don't care anymore. I don't care if you take tap dancing lessons. I will never look at you again." That got her up. She started walking towards me. When I looked over her shoulder, my parents were standing there. My parents started screaming, "She's walking! She's walking!" Well, you might notice I'm still a little upset because no one believed me. I used to stop the story here, but everyone had questions, so I'll fill you in. Margaret is now all grown up. Her cerebral palsy was mild enough that she was actually able to go to school. She can walk. She even went to college. Oh, she struggled, but she did it. And then she got out of school, and she got a job. But I always thought that my sister Margaret was probably the loneliest person I ever knew, because there was no one in her life for her. And then one night, my telephone rang. I picked it up, and it was Margaret. And Margaret said, "Tom, are you coming home to Boston soon?" I said, "Margaret, I'll try, but I'm on the road a lot these days." And she said, "Tom, I met somebody, and I want your approval because I think he's going to ask me to marry him." The big brother in me took over. I said, "Margaret, I will be home this weekend." I went home to meet them. His name is Stephen Thomas. He has a handicap as well. And they are so in love, it's nauseating. He's a nice guy. I said sure, and he proposed to her. And we said to my sister, what did she want for her wedding? And my sister said, "I want to walk down the aisle, and I don't want help." My sister still falls every so often, and when she does, you have to just rush her to the hospital. Her knees are completely worn out. Well, it's what she wanted. So we did our best to plan. We made sure that her shoes were flat so she wouldn't tip over, got the dress cut a little high so she wouldn't catch a toe. No white piece of paper down the aisle, she might slip on that. And that's as much as we could do. We went to the front of the church on the day of her wedding, and we waited. She wouldn't even take my father's arm. Down the aisle she came, holding on to her flowers. And she made it to the front of the church. And then, in the middle of the service, she had to stand up. And as she stood up, she lost her balance. And every person in my family, the instant she lost her balance, we all did exactly the same thing. We threw both arms out, like we could catch her, but she was too far away. We just had to watch. Margaret lost her balance for just a second, and then she caught it again, and she didn't fall. And the service was over. And down the aisle the two of them go, and she made it. She didn't fall over. Well, now it was time for the reception. And at the reception, the bride and groom have their dance, and we all got in a great big circle around them. And as the music started, and they started to dance together, I lost it. I started crying. And then I got embarrassed because I thought everybody would be laughing at me. I wiped away my tears and I looked. It was then that I realized no one could see me. The two of them, they were looking at each other. And every other person in the circle was crying so hard they couldn't see a thing. Because if you had told us on the day that she came home from the hospital, "Someday you'll see her dance at her wedding," we would have thought you were being mean, because we thought she would never even walk. The story I just told you is absolutely true. It's about my sister, Margaret.
There was once a king who was so busy ruling his kingdom in justice and peace that he forgot to get married and have children. It can happen. Well, one day he was looking at himself in the mirror and he said, "Oh, I'm old." Well, he didn't mind getting old so much, but he did mind leaving his kingdom without an heir, a king or a queen, when he died. So he decided to have a competition. Anyone could take part, rich or poor, young or old, girl or boy, and the one who passed the competition the best would be the new king. word was sent out, and among all those who heard about the competition was a young boy, and he thought to himself, "Oh, well, I can, so I think I will." So on the day of the competition, that boy got all dressed up in his finest clothes and headed down to the palace. Well, you should have seen the people who had gathered there. They were rich and wise and powerful people. And the boy looked around and he thought to himself, "I can't compete with this." And he started to leave. But just as he did, the curtains were drawn, the trumpets were blown, and the king appeared. "Welcome, all of you taking part in this competition today. Perhaps one of you shall be king or queen. Now in my hand is a bag. In the bag are seeds. I shall give each one of you a seed, and the one who grows the finest plant in 6 months shall be king or queen." The boy thought to himself, "Oh, I can grow a seed." And he took his seed and he ran all the way home, and he got a pot and he filled it up with rich soil and planted the seed and put it in the sun and watered it every day. 1 month, 2 months, 3 months passed, but still nothing had grown in the pot. He tried a little more sun, a little less water. He tried everything. 4 months, 5 months, 6 months. Empty pot. On the day of the competition, his mother came out and saw the boy just kicking the dust with his feet, and she said to him, "Isn't this the day of the competition? Why aren't you getting dressed up and going to see the king?" "Well, because, Mother, I didn't grow anything. What's the point?" "Well, the point is that you've done your best. You should see it through." And so the boy picked up his empty pot and made his way to the palace. You should have seen what it was like in there. It was like a forest. People were carrying these great big pots with fruit trees and flowering trees and creepers and palms, and here was he with an empty pot. You can imagine how he felt. The boy looked around and he thought, "Oh, I can't compete with this." And he turned to go, but just as he was about to go, the curtains were drawn, the trumpets were blown, and the king appeared. "Welcome, all of you, taking part in my competition today. Perhaps one of you will be king. Line up. Let me see what you've grown." And the boy thinks to himself, "Oh, well, I've come this far." And so he goes to the end of the line. He can hear the king saying, "Marvelous, magnificent," as all the people are filing by with their great big plants. And when it comes time for the little boy, he's all scrunched over and he scurries by so that the king doesn't notice that he's got an empty pot. And as he's scurrying by, suddenly there's a heavy hand on his shoulder. And he thinks to himself, "Oh no, I've upset the king." And he looks up and he sees the king's face. And there is the king beaming at him. And then he hears the king say, "We have found a new king." What? Excuse me, how could I be king? I've only got an empty pot. And the king said loudly so that everyone could hear, "I don't know where you got your plants from, but the seeds that I had given you had been boiled for a night and a day. They were dead. Nothing could have grown from the seeds that I gave you. And only one of you had the courage and the honesty to stand before me with an empty pot. He has the makings of being a king."
Do you have an older brother or sister who can sometimes be a real pain in the neck? When I was little, I thought my older sister was the most knowledgeable and the most glamorous person in the entire world. Kathy even wore glasses shaped exactly like cat's eyes, swooping up to a point on either side. And on each pointy tip there were 3 honest-to-goodness real diamonds. Or so I thought. When we rode in the back seat of our sea green Chevy, my big sister would open her arms wide. Ever gullible, I rushed in for hugs, at which point Kathy's boa constrictor arms crushed my chest while she dug those pointy-tipped glasses right into the soft skin of my temples. When my squeals caused my parents to turn around, all they saw was a sweet picture of sisters hugging. They'd roll their eyes. Yvonne always has been so sensitive. Years pass, and relationships mellow. So when my big sister came to visit me, I cooked a celebratory feast. We stayed up late talking about people and books we loved. The next morning was one of those rare November gifts. I stepped out into air crisp as a Macintosh apple, opened my arms to breathe it in and... smelt the rotting sweetness of trash. My eyes snapped open to see my garbage can lying on its side, the remains of baked ham and sweet potato pie scattered on the grass. Raccoons, I thought. Almost since the earth was born, raccoons and their cousins, the coatis, have been upending cylinders, digging with long claws, and wiggling long, pointy noses, seeking rotting treasure within. And I remembered this story told about those scavengers by the Mayan people of Mexico. Long before the earth was as full of life as it is today, 2 brothers paddled their boat north along the coast of the Yucatan Peninsula. Hour after hour the brothers paddled, seeing only shimmering, unending sand and lush, unending jungle. The twins' identical honey-colored arms paddled smoothly as their cocoa-colored eyes scanned the shoreline for any signs of life. Born exactly 1 minute apart, their hunger grew identically into a snarl within their bellies. Finally, they crossed the coral reef, beached their canoe high upon the sand dunes, becoming the first beings to ever stand on Sian Ka'an, the land where the sky is born. The brothers strode through the eerie shadows of the mangroves. Though older brother Hunter's eyes were piercing and quick, he beheld nothing to eat, neither bird nor berry. Through the low brush and into the high jungle they searched. Machetes glittered star-like as they cut through hanging vines. Finally, a thicket was pierced, and before them was a wonderful tree. It was wide, expansive, and it was tall, extensive, and there, up at the top, hung a beehive. Where there is a hive, there is honey. The brothers reached for the lowest branch, but it was too high to reach. They stretched their arms around the trunk, but it was too thick to shinny up. "Why don't you boost me up?" said younger brother. "I'll pull you up after me." "Boost you up? I'd rather not," said older brother. So younger brother bent over and offered his back for older brother to climb. Older brother reached up and into the tree. Older brother pulled himself up upon the branch. Below, younger brother looked up. "What about me?" "Pull you up? I'd rather not." And older brother began to climb branch after branch upwards. At last he reached the beehive, reached out and broke off a piece of honeycomb. Out dripped thick amber sweetness. Again, older brother reached forth and broke off honeycomb. Far below he heard a voice. "What about me?" "Give you some? I'd rather not." Hunter reached again for more honeycomb and discovered that his hands were full of dried up, sucked up, used up honeyless honeycomb. He tossed them aside. Down through the leaves they fell, landing right by younger brother's feet. Younger brother looked at those dried up, used up, sucked up, honeyless honeycombs tossed upon the soft green moss and thought, "Yuck." And again from above he heard as more discarded trash landed on the ground. And this time he thought, "I can use this." Younger brother picked up a honeycomb, scraped out the wax, rolled it between his hands until it became warm and soft, and shaped that wax into a long cylinder. He scraped and rolled more wax into a small cylinder and attached that leg onto the first cylinder. Then a second leg and a third and a fourth leg were attached. Next, a long bushy tail, and finally, a small head with a long pointy snout. "That'll do." He placed the wax creature on the ground, right where the tree fits into the earth, and reached for more wax to make another creature, and a third, and a 30th. He lined the wax creatures all around the base of that huge tree, at the exact place where earth meets bark. Then younger brother, whose name was Sorcerer, waved his hands, and the coatis came to life, digging at the base of the huge tree with their long claws, sticking their pointy snouts into the crevices, and wiggling and jiggling until the tree began to wiggle and to jiggle, and plunk! It fell to the ground. Startled, the coatis escaped into the jungle. Older brother fell out of the tree, and as he hit the ground, Sorcerer waved his hands again. And older brother turned into a pig. Older brother looked up. "What about me?" Younger brother looked down at those piggy little eyes and at that greedy little snout. "Turn you back? I'd rather not." And older brother ran into the jungle. Thereafter, to populate the world with pigs, remind us of the joys of recycling, and supply my sister with a feast of baked ham and sweet potato pie.
occasionally the real teacher in the classroom is not the teacher, but the student. For you see, sometimes the teacher is the one that really needs to learn the lesson. This was the case for me a few years ago when I was privileged to have a young student named Christy in my classroom. Christy was born with cerebral palsy, and her body was frail and twisted, and she was confined to a wheelchair. Her hands often shook and sometimes had trouble controlling her movements. Because of all this, she had a different perspective than most on life. Christy had the most pleasant personality. Her smile and laughter were contagious, and she lit up a room when she entered it, and she was well loved by everyone, her peers and teachers alike. Why, kids would often fight over who got to push Christy down the hall and have races with her up and down the hallway riding on the back of her wheelchair. Well, while her body was weak, her mind was as sharp as a tack. She was creative and intelligent and an excellent student. Her insights and writings were often surpassing her young years. It was indeed a pleasure to have Christy as a student, and I grew to love her. Well, one morning while I was teaching a geometry lesson, I heard the doorknob rattle. And I thought it was the wind or something, and I just ignored it. Well, it rattled again, and in a few minutes the door flung open and in rolled Christy. She was so excited that she was literally shaking, and she said, "Miss H." That's what she always called me. "Miss H, I couldn't wait. I had to come down here and tell you first thing this morning." I stopped what I was doing, and I said, "Well, what is it, Christy? What do you need to tell me?" "I couldn't wait to tell you. I couldn't wait to tell you. Last night, I walked 3 steps. Well, after sharing her excitement and telling her how proud I was of her, she left my room to go on and share her news with others. Well, after she left, I had to leave the room too. I was so overwhelmed that I had to leave and gain my composure. I thought to myself, 3 steps? What are 3 steps to me? I take 3 steps without even thinking. At that moment, I was very humbled. I was hit square in the face with how much I take for granted and just how proud I was of Christy. Well, that's one of those life lessons that I needed to learn. At that time, I took some extra time to say thanks for all the things that I take for granted. All the things that I'm able to do on a daily basis. And from that moment on, I've kind of looked at life a little differently. Thank you, Christy, for teaching me the lesson that I needed to learn.